everybody hear me okay?
Yeah, sounds great.
Yes.
Okay, so today my name is Stephee Bonifacio, and I'll be presenting Scully's Monstrous, Motherhood, Feminism, and the X-Files. I'm wearing a Mulder It's Me t-shirt. It's all very exciting. So I've never liked science fiction. I've never really even liked investigative dramas. I've always leaned towards domestic, heartwarming shows, stories that are realistic and rooted in things that I find familiar. And the X-Files at its simplest form is none of those things. It's a supernatural investigative drama surrounding two FBI agents searching for the truth within the unexplainable X-Files. Revolving around aliens and government conspiracy, the show is nothing like anything I've ever enjoyed before. But when I watched it, I was immediately obsessed, and that's mostly because of the character of Special Agent Dana Scully. I saw a commonality in her that I intensely identified with. She's a badass woman of equal, if not higher, intellectual standing to her male partner, and she's who I would have watched as a little girl and been like, yes, that's what I want to be. So almost 3 decades have passed since this cult classic premiered on television, becoming what would ultimately define the zeitgeist of the 90s. And for those who don't know, the premise is fairly simple. So Special Agent Dana Scully, a pragmatic medical doctor and FBI agent, is assigned to essentially debunk Special Agent Fox Mulder's work in the X-Files. Mulder is interested in all things supernatural, but has a specific fascination with aliens because when he was a child, he believes his sister was abducted. Scully joins him on what begins the journey to find his sister, but transforms into a deep dive into government corruption and conspiracy. The show is famous for many things, but became and remains one of the most successful sci-fi series because of the way that it challenged gender roles. So Chris Carter, the series creator, has explicitly stated that he originally intended on flipping the gender stereotypes. Gillian Anderson's Scully embodies this masculine objective in many ways, maintaining a consistent sense of rationality and logic, while David Duchovny's Fox Mulder lives in subjectivity and is substantially more emotionally led. Gillian Anderson quickly became a feminist icon on and off screen. There's even something called the Scully effect that emerged, which was a study via the Gina Davis Institute on Gender Media that proved that as of 2018, 63% of women who work in STEM cite Dana Scully as a role model. So all those little girls watching in the 90s were like, that's what I want to be, and then they did it. But categorizing something as feminist is complicated, especially when that something originated 27 years prior. So Dana Scully undoubtedly is a feminist icon and a character that women and girls have and will continue to look up to. But that being said, the show is not immune to criticism, especially when analyzing through a post-Me Too lens. The 1990s were a time when post-feminism was rampant. Following the women's liberation movement in the 60s and 70s, people believed that feminism had succeeded and maybe even gone too far, so it wasn't needed anymore. So since Scully was equal to the men in her workplace, according to this mode of thought, she'd have nothing to complain about ever. So both Scully and Gillian Anderson had to fight their own battles silently in the face of that imaginary. And doing research, I found out there were actually a lot of inequalities. So early on in the series, Gillian Anderson was instructed to always remain a few feet behind David Duchovny. And Scully, while supposedly equal to her partner, never had a desk. And Gillian Anderson was paid scarcely half of David Duchovny's rate for the majority of the show's runtime. He got offered a $5 million contract for a future film they did, and she got offered $400,000. And this disparity continued through the series revival in 2016. But most notably, Dana Scully, an accomplished forensic scientist with a thriving career in the FBI, never truly had control over her own body. It's specifically her ambivalent reproductive journey that cuts her impact as a feminist icon significantly. To briefly summarize, in order to accommodate Gillian Anderson's real-life pregnancy, in season 2 they wrote that Scully was abducted. She was gone for a whopping 1 episode, and when Scully was found, she had no memory of what happened to her. Fast forward through the seasons, and because of what was done to her during this abduction, she ended up getting cancer and was ultimately rendered unable to conceive. This conflict of infertility could be acceptable in serving the narrative of the ways in which this quest for truth slowly destroys two agents' lives, but it's later in the series when Scully miraculously does become pregnant that raises qualms for the feminist critic. This disturbing picture of motherhood that arises when Scully immaculately gets pregnant on the show problematizes Scully's status as a feminist icon. Even as Scully is a strong and independent female scientist, her body is constantly positioned as the bearer of meaning, while she is denied agency as the subject. Because she's the bearer of meaning, she cannot be the creator of it. A close analysis of the show's mythology reveals a severe prohibition of Scully's sexuality in general, and the show's strange manipulation of her reproductive journey ultimately expresses a patriarchal effort to control women and their wombs. And I want to preface that I'm not arguing that being a woman is defined by having a womb, nor am I asserting that only women have wombs. But only people with wombs can carry children, and regardless of how they identify, the patriarchy seeks to control them all. So throughout my analysis, I rely heavily on Laura Mulvey's criticism of the male gaze in cinema, Barbara Creed's concept of the monstrous feminine, Karen Horney's theory of womb envy, so you're going to have a little bit of redundancy there, and Beauvoir and Irigaray's ideas around gender ambivalence. The fight for reproductive rights is interestingly reversed in the X-Files, as these alien human hybrid children are created with Scully's ova without her knowledge. She has this urge to be a mother and is, in the sense that children with her DNA exist, but she's never allowed to mother those children. And even when she does give birth and have a child, she's forced to give them up for adoption. So the show asserts through this plotline that a powerful, intelligent, career-focused woman exists as a separate entity from their idea of mother and motherhood. And it's ironic the ways in which the X-Files' portrayal of Scully's embodiment of motherhood necessitates a man, but the general creation of children does not necessitate a woman. Karen Horney reimagines this psychological concept of motherhood. She references Ferenzi's genital theory, which outlines that the ultimate desire for both sexes is to return to the mother's womb. So we have this idea of womb envy that Caitlin talked about that contrasts with Freud's penis envy. And it's very heteronormative, but the X-File does exist in those heteronormative bounds. And this womb envy is continually evidenced by the through line of children being created by men without a woman's consent to serve a male agenda. A big part of this wedge between Scully and the prospect of motherhood is the prohibition of her sexuality. Mulder is a blatantly sexual character, and there are multiple scenarios wherein the women that he's involved with in cases show interest in him, and he pursues it, and there's no consequence for him. There's even a through line of Mulder having a porn collection and addiction that goes on throughout the series. However, if Scully is ever pursued or pursues sexually, she's met with intense ramification that usually results in her life being threatened. So Barbara Creed's theory of the monstrous feminine allows for an interesting analysis of this forbidden sexuality. It's kind of like the Madonna whore complex. In order for her to be seen as credible and capable in her line of work, she essentially has to be asexual. Barbara Creed in her research focuses primarily on the horror genre and discusses that the misconceptions of female sexuality are inherent within the genre. She highlights the common trope of the virtuous or pure woman surviving to the end of the film, while the woman who exhibits sexual behavior will often die early in the narrative. This exemplifies that sexually active women are often pigeonholed as harlots who warrant their own death, and only pure, chaste women deserve to live. So when the writers do decide to get Scully pregnant without explanation, it is only then that we see the allowance of her femininity to come through. So femininity is okay if it's paired with motherhood, and masculinity is okay when in the workplace, but they can't coexist here. And neither of these archetypes allot for any sort of sexual freedom. Mulder, on the other hand, exists in all three of these realms, professional, sexual, and later paternal, with no issue. The writers just generally put Scully through the ringer more than they do Mulder, and Scully is in fact met with extreme adversity on almost an episodic basis. Be it a kidnapping, infatuation turned violent, or simple emotional vulnerability, Scully is constantly victimized for her womanhood. It's like if she reveals that she's female in any way, female equates with weakness, and that can be preyed upon. And it should be noted that it's not an overriding pattern that Scully is thrust into the role of damsel in distress. Sometimes she saves Mulder, as you can see here, and sometimes Mulder rescues her. And sometimes it's their strength together that keeps them alive. And so while there is an attempted equality on this front, there's generally just an overall higher expectation of female bodies, both on and off the screen. I mean, Gillian Anderson's required return to set just 10 days after having a child is indicative of this elevated standard, one that translates onto the screen. Scully is expected to transcend her dire circumstances without any indication of struggle or weakness, and she does. Mulder, however, is not only allowed to struggle and stew and process for seasons at a time, but he's not put in the type of dire situations that would require him to adapt and overcome in the extreme way that's forced upon Scully. Her own genetics and biology are transformed into a weapon used against her in a way that Mulder never experiences. In many ways, Scully is a medical rape victim, like assaulted and violated by the government she works for and the alien she's trying to find. And frankly, it's a cheap device to require that Scully be molested in this way if she's to maintain status as a strong female character. So this all boils down to understanding Bourgeois and Irigarei's points about reproductive ambivalence. So truly throughout this research, I feel like I came to finally understand why the patriarchy feels the need to control reproductive rights. Like, I've always known that women's bodies are and like will continue to be under attack, but I've never understood why. And honestly, it wasn't even clear to me until 2 days ago when I was frantically trying to condense my 30 pages of research into a 10-minute presentation. So Bourgeois and Irigaray talk about the ambivalence or contradictory feelings that arise when women are understood as tied to nature, materiality, and the realm of immanence, the theory of the divine manifested in the material world, but are simultaneously viewed as other, capital O, to men. The ability to create life within a body is something that's viewed as holy and pure, but at the same time, women's bodies are viewed as nothing but an object for men to use to reach their own transcendence. And it's this ambivalence, these contradictory feelings around the female body, that is the reason that the patriarchy feels the need to exercise control over women's bodies, because they're petrified of women transcending men, because if those who reproduce had their own bodily autonomy and ability to control how and when they reproduced, that power of creation would be almost godly. And it is this reason that Scully can't have any control over her body or her ability to procreate. Because in order for her to exist as a character created and consumed by the patriarchy, to exist as a powerful, independent, intelligent, career-driven woman, she cannot be a mother. This was the unconscious trade-off in order for her to exist during this post-feminist era on mainstream television. There needed to be control over her body and womb if she was going to be allotted the amount of power that she was. There was a lot of hope for progress in these areas when they announced that they were making the revival in 2016, and there was a lot of progress. Mulder and Scully were finally allowed to be seen as a couple in some ways, and it was even included that they inarguably did have sex, and Scully was allowed to reclaim a little bit of her sexuality in this way. Additionally, it was a big deal that they showed a real grief around William, the son that she was forced to give up, which was a huge change from other seasons. As I mentioned previously, Scully's emotional and physical endurance is tested constantly on the show, and it's very telling that audiences never get to see her process anything. She's traumatized, she survives, she moves on. Her body is violated, she survives, she moves on. She's forced to give up her child, she survives, and she moves on. And girls watching could understand that, yes, she can get through anything, it seems like, but there was no evidence that she did any emotional work to get through these things. So showing some real grief in the revival was a big step. But in regards to Scully's reproductive journey, Chris Carter just added more fodder to my argument when, as a series finale in 2018, Scully gets pregnant again. And at this time, there was at least sex prior to the pregnancy, but does it serve the character and the story to get a 54-year-old originally barren woman pregnant? I don't know. So none of this takes away from Scully's impact as a feminist icon, nor does it take away from the impact that she's had on me. Through this research, I have uncovered for myself a lot of the reasonings for why the patriarchy exercises and mandates control in the way that it does. And while researching and watching and rewatching, I kept thinking over and over, Scully deserves better. Like, this badass character deserves better opportunities and more empowering representation. And though I began to look at my own life and my own experiences, I started to think, well, I deserve better too. I deserve to have control over my own body, as does everybody. And I feel like, ironically, I have discovered a sort of truth there during this project, and whether or not Chris Carter intended it, because of Scully, I'm not going to be quiet about it anymore. So thank you so much.
Okay, a round of applause for Stevie again.